Following Gran Colombia's collapse, the remaining land of modern-day Colombia and Panama would be officially renamed to La República de la Nueva Granada, or the Republic of New Granada, in 1832. Besides this new title, however, the region was facing a huge crisis of identity. With Venezuela and Ecuador gone and Bolivar passed on, many important questions would arise over the direction of this new republic. Would it be federal or centralized, civilian-led or militaristic, religious or secular? These tensions would become the cornerstone of many political debates moving forwards. For now though, the country was still reeling from years of civil strife, which had severely impacted its economic landscape. Industries such as agriculture and mining had all but ground to a halt. Port cities such as Cartagena and Santa Marta, meanwhile, would lose their once vital prominence in international trade, with foreign merchants hesitant to embrace a region so rife with instability. Incidentally, the mass collapse of industry would contribute to the emancipation of many enslaved labourers. Without any lands or means of survival though, a large portion of these individuals would simply become displaced. With the onset of an industry and government power vacuum, this era would also see many military veterans from the wars of independence leap at the opportunity for wealth and influence over the region. Not intent on fading into obscurity, they'd soon seize control over a great portion of local trade and land, eventually even entering the realm of political leadership. Their military prowess, however, would rarely translate into administrative competence. Instead, a culture of clientelism would emerge, where battlefield accomplishments were favoured over political experience, and nepotism and favouritism were commonplace. Meanwhile, the Catholic Church in the region would soon see the loss of official recognition from the Vatican due to a string of anti-clerical reforms passed by the new government, more on that new government in a bit, that had stripped it from traditional privileges. Despite this, the Church would maintain a hold over many important societal institutions, such as marriage and education, upholding itself as the moral backbone of the struggling republic. Many clerics would also come to fill a vacuum in governmental roles, often within judicial institutions and village councils, where they could exert a great influence. On a larger scale, the aftermath of Bolivar's death would see the rise of two opposing political visions for the nation. From Bolivar's followers, the push was for a highly centralized government that could exert control over the region as needed. On the other side, however, were the supporters of Santander, who advocated for a decentralized government and stronger autonomy among individual regions. These competing visions would see the country divided, with ideological loyalties differing starkly between departments. The capital department of Cundinamarca, for instance, unsurprisingly advocated for a centralist government that could exert control over the nation, whilst local elites in other regions, such as Valle de Cauca and the Caribbean coast, favoured a federalist approach. For now at least, it would seem that the latter camp had the upper hand. Santander, with the support of his followers, had recently returned from exile and assumed the presidency in 1832. Almost immediately after regaining office, Santander would implement a number of national reforms aimed at reducing state militarism and transforming the nation into a more liberal and secular society. Namely, these included reducing the army's share of the national budget by around a quarter, along with introducing philosophical teachings and beliefs to universities that were not based in or necessarily compatible with Catholicism, something which he had hoped would drive immigration from non-Catholic countries. Despite these ambitions, however, much of Santander's reputation would ultimately be thwarted by contentions over the country's staggering debt. In an attempt to improve the situation, Santander would try diversifying the economy beyond its gold and tobacco output, sadly to little success. With a lack of capital, major infrastructure projects such as roadways and river transport therefore would be put aside, fueling further discontent from the opposition. In addition to this, fractures would soon begin to grow out of Santander's moderate ideological standing. Appealing to his secular reforms whilst also trying to appease the church would prove quite the balancing act and would ultimately lead only to greater division. On one hand, urban liberals wanted faster modernisation in society, but rural elites and clergy were afraid that such reforms would erode their traditional authority. Santander's struggle in not upsetting either side would result in a kind of institutional inertia, viewed by many as an absence of strong leadership. Not long after Santander's term ended, the country would experience its first war since the Wars of Independence, La Guerra de los Supremos, or the War of the Supremes, from 1839 to 1842. The spark for this war came from a new law passed by Santander's successor, President José Ignacio de Marquez. The highly controversial reform would order the closing of certain temples and convents so they could be auctioned off and used for secular purposes, such as schools. In response, a group of regional leaders known as Supremos would revolt, under the motive of protecting religious freedom. As time went on though, this motive evolved into a mere pretext, an excuse to reject centralized authority and thereby expand their own regional power. The civil war that arose from this conflict would see the Supremos tear through entire towns that were centralist loyalists. Many of the male farmers in these areas, meanwhile, were either drafted into militias or fled to avoid conscription, which would have a drastic effect on agricultural cycles, leading to both food shortages and inflation. The war would thankfully come to an end by 1842, thanks to the methodical defeat of many rebel factions under President Pedro Alcántara Herrán. Even still, the discourse surrounding church-state relations and federalism more broadly would leave the country deeply fractured for years to come. Throughout this era, Colombia was also experiencing a great territorial expansion, with many settlements populating interior regions in particular, such as Antioquia, Tolima, and the Coffee Axis. As with the Civil War, however, this expansion came with its share of violent displacements. Peasant communities would often be violently uprooted in order to make way for larger developments, while land titles granted to the military and urban elites would push indigenous and Afro-descendant communities away into marginal areas. Whilst many of these colonisation projects were promoted as a means of national integration, the results were often the complete opposite, giving way to both local rebellions and coercive systems of labour. Meanwhile, on a philosophical front, Colombia would experience a wave of new political ideology throughout the following decades of the century, influenced mainly by popular thought from the French Revolution. Many of the utopian ideas of the time took the country by storm, even seeing constitutional amendments drafted as a result. Perhaps the most transformative of these reforms was the abolition of slavery in 1851, which would see the liberation of up to 25,000 Afro-Colombians. Though the act of official emancipation itself was an undeniable triumph, unfortunately very few material benefits would follow for the liberated. Without any compensation or land, many of these individuals would simply find themselves continuing to work in the same exploitative labour arrangements as before, just to make ends meet. This era of liberal reform under the now liberal government went far beyond slave emancipation, however. On a broader level, the liberal revolution could be viewed largely as a concerted effort to, once again, secularise the country by curbing the church's authority over society. This included the secularization of education, the introduction of civil marriage, and even some radical democratic experiments for the time. In 1853, for instance, women in the small town of Vélez were briefly given the right to vote, one of the earliest known instances of female suffrage in the world. Such experiments were a true testament to the intellectual fervour of the time, with revolutionary liberal doctrines being spread far and wide. Even still, traditional ideologies persisted, particularly when it came to the subject of racial hierarchy. Despite being emancipated, Afro-Colombians, for instance, were often subject to racist presuppositions that viewed them as an issue to be rectified. One example of this was in how the ruling white class looked down on these communities due to their supposed excessive breeding. To solve this alleged issue, the white elite would promote a policy known as blanqueamiento, or whitening. This was a movement that encouraged interbreeding between white and Afro-Colombian individuals so as to dilute black cultural influence in the offspring and allow white culture to permeate. Sadly, these pseudoscientific practices would remain entrenched for decades, even into the 20th century. Such racist attitudes could also be seen very clearly in certain census records and official documents of the time, which often omitted black racial categories or redefined them using euphemistic terms such as mestizo in order to downplay black heritage. Meanwhile, traditional African cultural expressions such as drumming, dance, and oral storytelling were framed as backward and would be suppressed by the ruling class. Sadly, indigenous communities would hardly fare any better. Their ancestral rescados, areas that legally protected indigenous self-governance, would be gradually eroded amidst the aforementioned territorial expansion, once again in the name of national integration. This, of course, would leave many landless, only adding to the ever-expanding list of displaced people. Afro-Colombian and indigenous communities were not the only marginalised peoples during this era, however. The Jesuits, who'd attempted to return to the country since their initial expulsion in 1767, would find themselves being expelled a second time in 1861 under the broader liberal reforms that were sweeping the nation during the time. As mentioned earlier, the broader goal of these reforms was to reduce the Catholic Church's influence over society, an effort that culminated in a complete rewriting of the Constitution in 1853 by the Liberal government. In this transformative document, church and state were officially separated. Beyond religion, the new constitution also stripped the president's authority to elect regional governors, marking a huge step towards decentralization. Although this direction may have appeared contradictory to the Liberals' early ideals of a centralized state, there was some strategy behind it. Namely, this decentralization was less a change in the Liberals' inherent ideology and more of a practical device used to weaken the entrenched ecclesiastical power of the Catholic Church, which had become deeply embedded into national institutions up until this point. By enabling local governors to be chosen by provincial assemblies instead of the president, it meant that there was no longer a centralist interference that could enforce religious orthodoxy. In turn, this allowed for the potential of regional governors who aligned with more secular or progressive ideals. Although many liberals championed the reforms, their government was far from unified. Many within their camp would disagree on both the scope and pace of the reform, leading to severe ideological fragmentation. This in turn left their party unstable and vulnerable to any unified opposition. Conservatives, meanwhile, were watching this unfold to great disgust. To them, the reforms were perceived not as some simple, inconsequential policy changes, but rather an all-out assault on traditional beliefs and morality fundamental to the nation. Decentralization was also viewed as a potential threat to traditional provincial hierarchies of which conservative influence relied on. Such frustration, however, extended well beyond the conservatives. As it happened, a group of disgruntled liberal rivals known as the Sociedades Democráticas were also upset with the current government. As a group comprised of artisans, their chief concern, however, had little to do with religious reform and more to do with the government's laissez-faire trade policies, of which they felt undercut local artisan livelihoods. With the government fragile from ideological disarray, however, these rival liberals saw a window of opportunity for a power grab. The following year, in 1854, they therefore conduct a military coup under General José María Melo, overthrowing Liberal President José María Obando and propelling Melo into a dictatorship over the country. This, of course, did not go down well. In retaliation, many conservatives and liberals who view the dictatorship as illegitimate would form a coalition against the regime aiming to overthrow Melo. Before long, their efforts would spark a civil war that lasted months, until they finally managed to defeat Melo in December 1854. From here, a couple of liberal and conservative leaders would serve as acting presidents until 1857, at which point conservative leader Mariano Ospina Rodriguez would assume office as the winner of a national election. The following year, Ospina would go on to officially rename the country La Confederación Granadina, or the Granadine Confederation, under a new constitution. In an ironic turn of events, his government would also embrace federalism, the very thing the conservatives had fought against when the liberals were in. The reasoning, however, was largely strategic. Despite the conservative regeneration, the reality was that the liberal political class had not been fully purged from the national government. Enabling federalism, therefore, would help to restrict these liberals' secular influence over the provinces. It would also, however, continue to divide an already disjointed republic, giving rise to regional strongmen known as caudillos. These ruthless men, often ex-military officers, would seize control over territories, often disregarding national laws and mandates. From this, different regions would develop their own distinct legal norms, militias, and even tax codes. The national government, meanwhile, with its diminishing tax revenue, lack of a unified army, and dwindling legal influence, would weaken significantly. Just as with the liberals before, this made the conservative government vulnerable to a takeover, which once again is exactly what happened. In 1860, military general and former liberal president Tomás Cipriano de Mosquera launched a civil war against the Confederation, which would ultimately see him seize control of the government. Despite declaring himself dictator, however, Mosquera was also a strong federalist, even more so than the previous government, in fact. Though this may seem contradictory, Mosquera viewed his dictatorship more as a means to an end, namely, to more effectively help him dismantle authoritarian structures. Despite the previous conservative government's push for federalism, Mosquera felt that they hadn't gone far enough. To further this goal, he'd sign into law a new constitution in 1863 in which he'd found Los Estados Unidos de Colombia, or the United States of Colombia. In this new constitution, each state would gain almost total sovereignty. Many independent services, such as the aforementioned tax systems and armies between regions, would be legally formalized, along with other institutions such as suffrage laws. Perhaps the most interesting reforms of the new constitution, however, came on the level of individual rights. Some notable changes included the abolition of the death penalty, the enshrinement of free speech, and the right to both bear and trade arms. Importantly, these rights weren't just ideals for Mosquera's government, they were considered vital safeguards against the potential for centralized tyranny. Though these rights were transformative for society in many important ways, however, the broader push for deeper federalism would once again come at a steep cost. The onset of autonomous power within the now semi-sovereign states would quickly be abused by local governors who'd often evolve into de facto warlords or dictators, entrenching their own personal rule. Another impactful facet of decentralization, meanwhile, came in the form of secularization. This did not, however, stem from anti-religious sentiment, but rather a desire for free communication of ideas, beneficial for both believers and non-believers alike. To this end, the Church's deep institutional power and influence was viewed as a crucial obstacle to overcome. To both weaken the Church's grip and assist in paying off public debt that had compiled due to the weak national tax system, the government would begin auctioning off huge areas of Church-owned land. Oftentimes, they'd significantly devalue these estates, selling them for a fraction of their real value. Although mildly successful from a fiscal perspective, this practice also came with some unintentional consequences. Namely, an influx of liberal-aligned buyers who'd now become landowners, and the resulting displacement of peasant families who lived and worked on church lands for generations. Even still, the church, despite its diminished political power, would remain a powerful social force. This was especially the case among the rural poor, who'd further championed traditional values since viewing liberalism as the cause for their displacements. Overall, the Liberal government did gain some economic traction during their tenure, however this would be short-lived. Following a steep drop in global tobacco prices, one of the nation's main exports at the time, the United States of Colombia would find itself in a deep fiscal crisis. The government's solution of, once again, selling off church land meanwhile, was not exactly helping public perception. This growing discontent, particularly among conservatives, would quickly build in tension, sending President Mosquera into desperation over holding his position. In 1867, he would even go as far as dissolving Congress in an attempt to rule by decree. This, of course, was seen as a huge betrayal of principles by his supporters and opponents alike. Within a few months, Mosquera would therefore be forcibly removed from office, exposing the major internal tensions within the Liberal government. Still, the Liberal reforms would continue under the remaining Liberal government, now led by Provisional President Santos Acosta. One notable area of their progressive vision was in public education. Beyond founding a public national university, the government also made elementary school free and compulsory. Within these state-run schools, a new national curriculum would then be established, which enforced religious neutrality and emphasized scientific reasoning where possible. In some regions, clergy would even be banned from teaching positions at schools, with religious content being replaced by natural sciences and positivist philosophy. This, of course, caused stark outrage for conservative families who felt their traditional values were being undermined. Even the Pope at the time condemned the curriculum, which would further affirm the backlash. Eventually, the situation would reach a melting point when conservative regional leaders, clergy, and disillusioned citizens began to stage armed revolts in protest. One of these would even spiral into a civil war lasting almost a year, simply known as the Colombian Civil War of 1876 to 1877. Eventually, a compromise was reached thanks to the election of a moderate Liberal president viewed as somewhat acceptable to both sides of the political fence. Initially appointed in 1880 for a 2-year term before returning in 1884, President Rafael Núñez was known largely for his pragmatism. Though interested in modernization, he also valued order and stability over senseless radical idealism. In a nutshell, Núñez's main initiative was to re-centralize the government and re-establish church presence.